Thank you, Dr. Dunn. Our last speaker for the afternoon session is Mark Perry, and he will discuss issues closer to home about Hezbollah and Hamas.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. I am driven by anecdotes, so I hope you don't mind. I will start by telling you where I come from, and not come from today. 30-some years ago, I hope that this doesn't get beyond this room, I was a community organizer. This is why I have a black shirt on. I was a community organizer in South Chicago with and it was no big deal. I was 20 years old. What did I know? I knew nothing. And I was an intern for a guy by the name of Saul Alinsky, who was a famous community organizer and wrote books on it. I was wise enough, even at the age of 20, to just keep my mouth shut and listen. And one of the things that Saul Alinsky and the Reverend Fry were doing in South Chicago was attempting to work with a gang called the Blackstone Rangers. And the Blackstone Rangers were an African-American gang and quite serious fellows. And they were well armed, and they were taking on the Chicago police and the Chicago gang squad. And so we were attempting to mediate their fight with the Chicago police and their fight with the Latin Kings, a Hispanic gang that were close enough to be a problem. And so Mr. Alinsky and some of his friends decided that what they would do is they would establish a ceasefire between gangs in South Chicago, and people would turn in their guns. Of course, they wouldn't really turn in their guns, but they turn in some of their guns. And it was quite an interesting moment when we all met in the basement of the Presbyterian Church in South Chicago and signed a rather detailed and negotiated document. And the police came in after the meeting and confiscated the guns, and they were put on the streets the next day, and we were all put in jail. And I was heartbroken. Absolutely, we'd spent a lot of time on this, and I went to see Mr. Alinsky. Very rare for me to see him. I just run the mimeograph machine. But I said, I don't get it. We worked, you worked. He said, oh, Mark. Shook his head. He said, you're so naive. Don't you understand the first rule? And I said, the first rule? And he said, yeah, the first rule. I said, what's the first rule? And he said, if you don't have a gang, how can you have a gang squad? And I've taken that on over 30, 35 years, and I've always gone out to meet the equivalent of the Blackstone Rangers in the world. And the equivalent of the Blackstone Rangers in our world is Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Terrorists, incapable of politics, violent people, fundamentalists. And I've gone out to meet them, and they've turned out to be quite different than what we think. You know, we Americans like to think, and I think the administration likes to think, that Hamas and Hezbollah, there are 5 major groups in the Middle East that are significant and that are going to influence the region for the next 20 or 30 years. Iran, Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and we don't talk to any of them. It's an unbelievable policy that the most important political groups, I mean, we were killing, I know a man who is the station chief in Kabul, and in the daytime he would kill Russians. That was his job when the Russians were in Afghanistan. And at night he'd go to the embassy and have drinks with them. We all knew this was going on. They knew it was going on. That was his job. And it was his job also to talk to them, to tell them, listen, this is going to continue until we can do something else that's a little bit more rational. They had 20,000 nuclear warheads. We sent a president to Reykjavik to talk to them about it. We didn't say, they're incapable of change. We tried to change them. They changed. So did we. And this is the kind of policy, I don't quite know where we got it. Dean Acheson said, I will go anywhere, anytime to talk to anyone about peace. Why don't we do that now? And instead we isolate these groups. And I feel that our policy of isolating Hezbollah and Hamas in particular, which I have the most experience with, has really in a funny kind of counterproductive way worked. They're isolated. Not only do we not know about them, they don't have a clue about us, and it's getting worse. So I get emails from Hamas leaders, I do. I'm sure I'm not the only one that gets them. And they say, this was a recent question. This is from a very intelligent man with a PhD. By the way, the 15 members of the Shura Council of Hamas, 9 of them have PhDs. They're not in Islamic studies. They're in the sciences, chemistry, physics. They're about as fundamentalist as I am. Maybe a little bit more. And the question from the email was, what did Joe Biden have to do to, who did Joe Biden have to make a deal with to become vice president? And I thought, how do you begin? How do you begin to answer a question like that without appearing to be presumptuous or Lawrence? So in these, our policies are now driven by assumptions that these groups, Hamas and Hezbollah, are puppets of Iran, dedicated to imposing a Sharia state, that they are well armed, they are violent people, that it's impossible to find an accommodation with them. And I think our blinkered policy has actually kind of turned them into what we forced them to be. We have taken what I call in the Middle East the Gironde, for those of you who remember your French history, the Gironde, the moderates of the French Revolution, and we are pushing them into the hands of the Jacobins. If you take a look at Salafist or Takfiri websites in the Middle East, they look at their primary enemy not as Christian hegemonists, Zionists from the West. We're number 2. Number 1 is people within their own communities, Sunnis and Shias, who cooperate with them. What does cooperate with them mean? They believe in democracy. They believe in constituent services. They believe in accommodation. They want to run their societies competently. They don't want to impose a social program. That's Hamas and Hezbollah. What's wrong with dealing with organizations who will stand for elections and win? Those are those 2 groups. And people who say, well, they're all one stripe and they all stand together and they're all against this, I say, well, what you ought to do is, which is what I did mistakenly, is what you ought to do is have a coffee reception in Beirut and invite Hamas and Hezbollah together into the reception, which I did. And Hamas stood in this corner, and Hezbollah stood in this corner. And they talk, but there's no love lost between these organizations. So I think that, our understanding the region is dependent on our ability to, if not talk, to at least listen to the 5 major players in the region: Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Muslim Brotherhood. I'll give you a couple more anecdotes. I was in Tunis at PLO headquarters in 1994. This was after Oslo was signed, but before Arafat returned to Gaza. And I was sitting with some of his aides into his headquarters, his home, swept Abdulaziz Rantisi, the Hamas leader, now deceased, killed, from Gaza. And